Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Mike Ewall. I'm the founder and director of Energy Justice Network. I'm going to flip over to my presentation. Okay. Like Bradley, I've been at this for a while, for about 23 years in my case, since I was in high school, first fighting off a trash incinerator in my home county in Pennsylvania. And I've been helping communities ever since do the same. I also don't come from a big environmental group. I have a small nonprofit that I run. We help communities all across the country. I've been a volunteer most of these years, but make very tiny bits of money now, enough to scrape by and help everyone. So we have a lot of information up on our website. If you go to energyjustice.net/incineration, you'll find copies of whole reports that were written about pyrolysis and other types of incinerators. So feel free to use that information as a resource and research base as you start to learn more about this stuff. Now, there are a lot of names tossed around for different types of incinerators. They know that incineration is a dirty word. I was actually sitting in the meeting of the trade association for the waste industry at a national trash incineration conference a couple years ago. And having paid to go to the conference, I was welcome to sit in that meeting, and they had debate over whether to use the I word. And one person was complaining that too many of the presenters at their own conference used the I word, and that was a bad thing. We shouldn't allow them to do that. And then others in there disagreed. And one woman with the International Solid Waste Association even said, well, I think we should use the I word because, or actually, this is a direct quote, I think we should call it incineration because that's what it is. And I furiously wrote that down, like, they admitted it, yes. So they have this contest going on around the country, basically, and they find every way they can describe it other than with the I word, because so many hundreds of these have been stopped by communities like this around the country and around the world when they realize what is actually in store for them. One of the people there actually made a point. He said, we went through all this trouble to change the name of our division from waste to energy from waste. It's crazy. So some of the technologies that we're talking about include pyrolysis, gasification, plasma arc, these different types of incinerators. And the only thing that makes them different than a conventional incinerator is that they do things in two steps. Basically, if you even light this piece of paper on fire, okay, technically, the paper is not even burning, okay? If we want to get technical about it, as we did over lunch with some of your city officials and one of their engineers, technically, if you light this on fire, it's not actually paper burning. What's happening is that it heats up and some gases are created, and then the gases, right, like a smidgen away from the paper, are what's burning, okay? So even a conventional incinerator, you can argue that it's gasification if you want to. And that's what they're doing here. They're basically saying that that first step of turning it to heat is different from the second step of the heated gases catching fire. And that's what they're going to be doing, is accomplishing incineration in a two-step process where the steps are a little more separated than you usually get, but it's still incineration. And this is the EPA's actual definition. For those of you who are policy wonks, I have the reference right here, 40 CFR 60.51A. That is a government definition. It's in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's been there for a while. This is nothing new. This is the definition of a municipal waste combustor. At the bottom here on a different part of EPA's webpage, they even spell out a municipal waste combustor is functionally synonymous, or sorry, municipal waste incinerator is functionally synonymous with a municipal waste combustor. Okay, so this is a definition of incineration for EPA. This is how they define it. And you'll see it means any setting or equipment that combusts solid, liquid, or gasified municipal solid waste, as MSW, including but not limited to pyrolysis. And it has a definition for pyrolysis, which says a unit that produces gases through the heating of municipal solid waste, and the gases are combusted and emissions vented to the atmosphere. That's exactly what Pyrolyzer is talking about doing here. So this couldn't be more clear that the federal government says this is an incinerator. So folks can have the linguistic games they want to play here and threaten to sue people for calling it what EPA knows it is and regulates it as, but I think this question is pretty settled. The European Union has similar definitions that call pyrolysis incineration as well. Now this here's a little probably hard to read at this distance, but I had to throw this slide in because this I've seen presented at waste industry conferences multiple times by this outfit called GBBs, Gershner, Brickner, and Bratton. They are the leading incineration consulting firm in the country. They constantly get hired by local governments. They constantly speak at industry conferences, and if anyone wants to know what's the state of incineration in this country, they go to these guys. These this outfit compares the different types of incinerator technologies and say what the risk is. And under pyrolysis, it says under risk summary, high. It's high risk. And the reason they put under risks and liabilities says previous failures at scale, like the scale they're talking about here, and even much smaller scales, uncertain commercial potential, no operating experience with large-scale operations. These are the industry folks talking to each other. This isn't Greenpeace. This isn't some radical environmental group saying this is a problem. This is the industry's own consultants saying this stuff doesn't work and it's high risk. In DC, where I'm currently living, they have an incinerator that they're pursuing building there. I just did a Freedom of Information Act request and got back information that showed that there's a different company we didn't even know about that was courting the mayor's office, and the mayor's office was telling the Department of Public Works, we think this is a good idea, you should go ahead and look into this. And the Department of Works folks, who are very excited about pursuing an incinerator of some sort, even wrote back and said, this gasification stuff, it's not been successfully modeled in the US or abroad. And they give an example of a project in Florida that has run into problems, getting even a turbine manufacturer to accept the risk and give a warranty of it because the fuel is not clean enough to actually burn effectively. Japan has had several ones that run intermittently, as they point out. And these facilities rely on a more homogeneous feedstock, a feedstock that is more consistent than trash. And that is exactly the problem you're going to run into here and why so many others have run into this problem. One of the places they ran into a problem is in Chester, Pennsylvania. This company came in about 5 years ago, an Israeli company called Koach Energy. It's actually Hebrew for energy, so it's energy. And they wanted to turn tires into petroleum with a pyrolysis process, pyrolysis and gasification combined. It would have been the largest of its type in the world at about 2,400 tons per day was the higher end of the scale of how big they wanted to build that. Well, the mayor of Chester, this is a Republican mayor in a town that is known for having some of the worst pollution problems anywhere in the country, wrote this letter that said that this is not the type of business that's consistent with the city's current or future development efforts. We're not interested, and we would not support bringing in businesses that would further feed into the perception that potentially polluting industries are welcome, and just goes on and just tears into this company and says they're not welcome here. Even saying, regardless of their job creation claims and alleged charitable benefits, is not aligned with the future direction of the city of Chester. And this is one of the most polluted places I've ever worked with. They have the largest trash incinerator in the country already, and they were saying that this was not welcome. When they ultimately built a very small pilot plant across the river in New Jersey at Rutgers University's Eco Complex, they ran this project and ended up losing $1 million of money when they just built this little experiment. They couldn't find investors for it. They found it was very polluting with black smoke coming out. The pyrolysis side of the project failed, and they decided that they would sell the test equipment for scrap. So some basic lessons here. Any kind of black box project, an incinerator of any sort, you have this garbage in, garbage out reality. You put mercury in the front end, mercury is going to come out the back end. You put chlorine in the front end in some form, it's going to come out the back end in some form. You can't make things magically disappear. These don't turn waste into energy. They turn them into toxic ash, or in this case char, and toxic air emissions. Also, nothing is 100%. So when they say they have pollution controls on there, there's still things that go through there, and we'll get more into that in a minute. Even when they say there are small amounts of something, like mercury, like dioxins, those small amounts matter, especially when they're small percentages of 6,000 tons per day. That's a large number, and so those small amounts are going to be quite significant. In our experience, we've seen hundreds of these proposed across the country and across the world even. Almost all of them never get built. There's not one of this sort operating commercially in the whole country, yet many have been proposed. So the idea that somehow they're going to get this built at all, no less by 2016, I believe is a fantasy, and I don't think is realistic at all. And if pyrolyzer is the answer, whether we're talking about for energy, whether we're talking about for managing waste, or whether we're talking about for creating jobs, someone asked the wrong question, because it's the worst possible answer for all three of those things. And lastly, on this side, the whole hippie bashing article that the mayor just did that's out there on the table, I just have to say that those who don't have an argument resort to name calling. We're not here about name calling. We're here about talking about facts. So just to put things in perspective, 6,000 tons per day is twice as much waste as Chicago generates. It's a little over a quarter of the waste that the whole state of Indiana generates. The largest trash incinerator in the country is in Chester, Pennsylvania, 3,400 tons per day. It would be the largest one in the country. It would be probably the largest one in the world. The largest one I'm aware of in the world for any kind of incinerator is 4,100 some tons per day. The largest pyrolysis one is 440. This would be 10 to 15 times as big as the largest one of its type in the world. That one's in Japan. So incinerators are not trash to steam. They're trash to toxic ash and toxic air emissions. Like I said earlier, this is the ash we can replace with char in this case. Same basic idea. And they're not waste to energy facilities, they're waste of energy facilities, because they actually destroy 3 to 5 times more energy embodied in those materials than you get back. If you have to recreate the paper and the plastics and all the things that are in there, it takes a lot more energy to do that than if you burn it and get a little bit of energy back. A couple months ago, I testified in DC, sitting at the same table as the head of the trade association for trash incinerators in this country. And they basically admitted that I was right on 2 counts, that they were more expensive than landfills and that they're dirtier than coal power plants. And in weaseling out of the coal power plant thing, they basically said, well, we're not power plants. Even though they make this whole big issue about how they're energy facilities, their trade association, after changing names a couple times, is now called the Energy Recovery Council. Yet they said, and this is on video on the website if you want to find it, I'll be glad to send people links. He said, a waste-to-energy plant is designed to manage solid waste. The electricity output is a secondary function. And if you look at where their money comes from, this is also evident because most of their money comes from getting paid to take waste, not getting paid for their electric sales. So it's not a power plant. If people were trying to build a power plant, they wouldn't go for the most expensive type that there is, which I'll get into in a moment. This is just the same guy admitting that's also the most expensive way to manage waste, that's more expensive than landfills. Now, this is data from the waste industry. When the National Solid Waste Management Association compared the fees of disposing of waste at landfills versus incinerators, they found that incinerators have always been more expensive, and that difference is widening over time as air pollution controls become more expensive to install. This is comparing traditional incineration. Pyrolysis is even more expensive than normal incinerators are. This here is data from the federal government, from the Energy Information Administration, which is part of the Department of Energy. In 2010, they put out the latest data on how expensive different forms of energy are. So if you were saying, gee, we have a problem here in Logansport, we need to replace the coal plant, what do we do? Well, you would think that your leaders would not go to the most expensive possible option according to the federal government. Whether you're talking about the cost of building it or the cost to operate and maintain it, trash incineration, and this is the conventional kind, not the more expensive kind they're entertaining here, is more expensive on both counts by far. Even wind and solar are cheaper. So if there's this debate over how to do your energy, gosh, I mean, I would jump straight to wind or solar if that were the option, because it looks a lot better than what they're looking at here. I covered a little bit of this, but I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to gloss over some of these things. But one of the key points here is just that the types of contracts that they need to run incinerators, because they're so much more expensive than landfills, are ones that make sure that the communities are locked into giving a certain amount of waste. And if they don't, they have to pay even if they didn't give that waste. They're called put or pay clauses in contracts. And so this is one of the ways that the industry stays alive, because they can't compete with landfills. So they lock local governments that are essentially suckers into these types of contracts. Some communities, like in Claremont, New Hampshire, 29 towns filed for bankruptcy because of this specific type of contract that they were locked into, and the court denied them that, and they had to pay up anyway. Incineration also competes with recycling. They need to burn papers and plastics, and so when they talk about turning things into refuse-dry fuel here, they talk about taking out the metal and the glass, but the rest of the recyclables that burn well, of course, they want to keep in, and so they're not going to make sure you recycle them. They're going to make sure you feed them into this burner. But especially given how big it is, they're going to need to feed a lot of this stuff into the burner, which is why in Detroit, where one of the largest incinerators is in the country, they have a miserable recycling program. They were pretty much non-existent in that city for many years. Now, 10 years ago, I warned the city of Harrisburg, in my home state of Pennsylvania, that they were going to go bankrupt if they went ahead and borrowed more money to put into the incinerator they already had, which was losing a lot of money over time. You see their existing debt in that first column there. Their officials, with all their high-priced consultants, said that if they pour $125 million more into rebuilding the plant, they're going to wipe out that debt and end up in the black, actually making money. I put some realistic assumptions into that and found out that the mid-case and worst-case scenarios were that they basically drive the city into bankruptcy. And after every slide I told them, this is going to put the city into bankruptcy. 8 years later, read the headlines, they were bankrupt, and now the state has taken over the city. A lot of other places have come close to this and have been bailed out or faced other economic consequences. These are just some examples of those places, which I won't go into detail with right now. So it's also the worst way to create jobs. If we're concerned about jobs, and we rightfully should be, the last thing we want to do is build something that creates very few jobs per amount of waste processed or per amount of money spent on it. Landfilling and incineration both create about 1 job per 10,000 tons of waste that are processed each year. You can get about 10 times as many jobs by recycling. And some cities like San Francisco just reached 80% diversion from landfills and incinerators with what they call a zero waste program that gets them as close to zero as they can. And that includes composting, recycling, reuse, and all those different pieces of the solution. This is just the same data in more detail. You'll see 10 times more jobs in the conventional, what they call recycling facilities, MRFs, or material recovery facilities. Other types of things like reusing computers, 296 more jobs than you get if you were burying or burning those. It's also the most polluting way to make energy. And this is data from the federal government, most of it. Some of it comes from state governments. This is comparing trash incinerators to coal plants per unit of energy. So if you made them the same size and gave an honest comparison, you'd see that for all these toxic and other types of pollutants, they're far more polluting than even coal is. This is the same chart just shown in the ratios, so you can see how it compares to coal for these different pollutants. And here is similar stuff, but on the global warming pollutant, carbon dioxide. Trash incineration is actually 2.5 times worse than coal for global warming. So all these different pollutants make them worse than landfills. They're basically skyfills. You take this pen, for example, and if you try to breathe or drink the toxins in this pen, it's going to be really difficult. You throw in a landfill, it's going to take a long time until these things are breathable and drinkable. You put this in an incinerator of any sort, pyrolysis included, and pretty quickly, some of these are going to end up in the air. Some of them are going to combine into chemicals that weren't even there in the first place, like dioxins, that are extremely toxic and will end up in the air. And the rest that don't, say you have the best pollution controls ever, which is really, really expensive, then you'll have less in the air and you'll have more in the solid waste and then the liquid wastewater that you have as well. And these will be much more available to your ability to breathe and drink them. And when that solid waste goes to a landfill, it's going to be more toxic for the groundwater than if you just dumped all the waste there directly. The company's basically saying that they're going to continuously monitor the pollutants, and you don't have to worry because the same song and dance that every company has is that they're going to be fined so heavily if they go over any limits, and you don't have to worry about it. But they basically admit that they're only continuously testing for certain pollutants. Periodic testing will be required for other pollutants. And they also admit that they're going to have this event that whenever there are pressure problems, things will not even go through the pollution controls. They'll just go and get burned off in a flare, bypassing the pollution controls when there are these emergencies like pressure problems in the facility. Now, the technology exists to continuously monitor these different toxic compounds, and a lot of different ones, the toxic ones and the non-toxic ones, but they're not going to use them because they're not going to be required to by the state. Generally, only 3 pollutants, none of which are the toxic ones, have to be tested continuously. The rest, 1 day per year. And it's like having a speed limit where 1 day a year there's a speed trap set and the person driving knows that it's coming because there's a big sign that tells them it's coming. And their brother is operating the speed trap because they hire their own consultants to do the testing. No wonder they don't find many problems. But when they do this, and this is how incinerators and a lot of smokestack facilities are usually regulated, when they do this, sometimes they still find violations, but the fact is that they're on their best behavior, and if you actually use the continuous testing, you'd find that there are a lot more violations going on a daily basis that they just are, what you don't know, like they pretend it doesn't hurt you. I'm going to skip over some of this because I'm running out of time. Let me see. Okay, on the health impacts, just want to point out that there are a lot of medical professionals that have come out opposed to incineration. Most of these in this list came out opposed to biomass incineration, like the burning of trees and wood waste. Trash is far more toxic even, so some of these groups would be very concerned even more so about this. Some of these are specifically, like the British Society for Ecological Medicine put out an extensive report on trash incineration in particular, and talking about how it's a very big problem and should be opposed. One of these, like the Erie County Medical Society, was specifically referring to tire incineration, which is another thing that's proposed here. So there's a lot of concern in the medical establishment about these for community health. And I know I'm running over. I'm getting the time thing. Can I go into just cover some of the dioxin stuff? Okay. So dioxins are the most toxic group of chemicals known to science. They largely climb up the food chain, end up in meat and dairy products. About 93% of the dioxin exposure you get is through meat and dairy. And it's created when you burn hydrocarbons. Anything like paper, plastic's got hydrocarbons in it, when there's oxygen present and chlorine present. Now, the companies claim that they run at low temperatures and that they don't have to worry about dioxins because dioxins are formed at high temperatures. They're wrong. EPA's own reports, all the science on this shows that dioxins are formed at relatively low temperatures, around 200 to 400 degrees Celsius. This is in the temperature range when it's cooling down after they're processed. But Pyrolyzer says that they brag about how they're operating at low temperatures. So they're operating closer to that range where dioxins are formed. And there is oxygen in that pyrolysis stage because their own data in their own report says so. And I looked at the numbers and it says there's carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide coming out where there are O's in the CO and CO2, and those are oxygen molecules. 20% of what they say is in the gas coming out of that pyrolysis unit is oxygen. So they have all the ingredients they need to make dioxin, and some of the pyrolysis plants that like Bradley talked about in Roma Land, California have had problems with dioxin emissions because they are designed in ways that create dioxins. So during question and answer, I have a lot of fun slides on tires incineration, which is going to be part of the process here, but I'm not going to get into that now. I also have more on zero waste and the solutions I'd be glad to get into in Q&A. So I'll leave it there and hand it off to the next speaker, but thank you, and we'll talk more in a minute.